Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. We are going to get started with today's webinar and a panel discussion. My name is Erin Baumgartner, and I'm director of the Houston Education Research Consortium. We're part of the Kinder Institute for Urban Research here at Rice University in Houston. And thanks so much for joining us for the conversation today. We thought it was a really important opportunity to take a chance and bring together folks from around the country who are doing important work around pre-K and early childhood education so that we can learn from each other and be ready for what's coming next and how we can best serve and support students and families in every district, every city that we live in. One of the things that you might have noticed in the title of the talk for today is that we're going to be sharing some learnings from research practice partnerships. And for those of you who aren't familiar with research practice partnerships, that's what happens, the way that I talk about it, when researchers recognize the value in partnering with practitioners like school districts or community organizations to make sure the research we're doing is on questions that they need answers to, where they're trying to make decisions and solve problems. And so that's a really important mechanism and way that research is happening in our different spaces around the country. And so we're going to be able to hear from someone from Chicago, from Baltimore, from San Francisco, and from us here in Houston around what are the things we're learning in this partnership that we're having with public school districts. I'm going to turn it over to Julie Suddeth, the president of PNC Bank Houston, to offer a welcome to everyone and get us started.
Thank you, Erin. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time to join the webinar. As Erin said, my name is Julie Suddeth. I'm the regional president for PNC Bank here in Houston. And on behalf of PNC, I want to welcome everyone to today's Education Research Engagement Series session. First, I want to start with a big thanks to the team at Kinder Institute for Urban Research and HERC for bringing us together on what is going to be a very important conversation. PNC is proud to serve as the lead underwriter of the series because it reflects something that we believe very deeply in at PNC, and that's that meaningful progress happens when research, practice, and community leadership comes together around a shared goal. And in this case, that goal is giving every child the opportunity to start school and life on strong footing. At PNC, this commitment comes to life through Grow Up Great, which is our signature early childhood education initiative supported by the PNC Foundation. For more than 20 years, PNC Grow Up Great has focused on helping prepare children from birth to age 5 for success in school and beyond. And here in Houston, that work has included partnerships with organizations, educators, and community institutions that are expanding access to high quality early childhood opportunities for children and families across this growing region. And I think what makes today's conversation especially important is that it moves beyond theory and into what is actually working. Public pre-K, as we know, is evolving very rapidly. And while every community is different and unique, the common thread is that the lasting impact requires all of us. We're all learning from one another and we're working from evidence, not assumptions. We need to bridge the gap between the ideas and implementation and make smarter investments in children, families, and communities. And so this conversation is about far more than education policy. It is about the future of the regions where we live. And speaking as a Houstonian, the strength of Houston's workforce we know and our economy and long-term competitiveness is going to depend on whether today's children have access to the kind of early learning opportunities and experiences that are going to help them thrive later in life. So with that, I just want to thank everyone for participating in today's discussion and to the presenters for sharing their expertise. We're so grateful to support this effort and excited about the conversation.
Thanks, Julie, and thanks for your support of this event and the other events that we have in this series. This isn't the first time that PNC is supporting us and helping share research to folks who might not have access to it typically. And so that's a great way that we've been able to use this event and these types of events that we posted over the years. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we're doing today and what the next 45 minutes or 50 minutes of our time together is going to look like. So first, I'm going to introduce our panelists. We're going to have a conversation. Like I said, we have this really great geographic representation. I joked and said, I don't know that I could have planned it better, but if you look at the north, south, east, and west, we're all represented in the folks who are going to be sharing with us today. What each person is going to do is talk a little bit about their context so we can understand pre-K looks different in different spaces. The laws around pre-K and how it's enacted and what it looks like is going to vary from place to place. So folks are going to give you a little snapshot of what that looks like. They're going to tell you what they feel like the most important findings or the biggest things they've seen in their space that we could maybe think about how that translates and what that might mean in our different locations. And then they're going to give us a little bit of a preview of what they think is coming next in pre-K. Then we're going to have a panel conversation. So we'll turn off the slides and I'll ask some questions of the panelists. But as you see, you have a Q&A function that's going to be open to you as well. So add some questions in there for the panelists to build on the things that you're hearing from them, upvote the ones that you think are really important and you'd really like people to answer, and we'll go from there. So to get us started, I'm just going to run through our panelists today. So Terri Sabol from Northwestern University, representing EC Reach, an early childhood research group at Northwestern University. Lieny, Jeon, who is a professor at University of Virginia, but represents the early childhood space at the Baltimore Education Research Consortium, or BERC. Courtney Thrash, who's on the HERC, Houston Education Research Consortium team here at Rice University. And then we've got the dynamic duo of Pamela Geisler and Laura Wentworth, who are coming to us from California. So they represent the partnership between Stanford University and San Francisco Unified School District. Pamela is our district side friend who's joining us, and Laura is the California Ed Partner side friend supporting the partnership who's joining us. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lieny to get us started.
Thank you, Erin. Hi, everyone. I'm very excited to be here to speak from the Baltimore City and Maryland context. Again, I'm Lieny Jeon. I'm Director of Early Childhood Initiative at the Baltimore Education Research Consortium, housed within Johns Hopkins University. So first of all, I would say we're in a very, very interesting moment of both long-standing pre-K access in Baltimore City and major statewide expansion in Maryland. So Baltimore City has actually been ahead of much of the state. And Baltimore City Public Schools has been offering free full-day pre-K for 4-year-olds for many, many years. So in Baltimore, we often describe pre-K for 4-year-olds as close to universal access. At the same time, I would be careful not to say that it is fully universal because seats are still managed through a priority system by the state, and priority is given to children with the greatest need. So priority one typically includes those who are income eligible, like at or below 300% of the federal poverty level, homelessness, receiving special education services, or are eligible for English language services. So basically, our access in Baltimore City is still shaped by priority tier, school capacity, and family's choice. At the state level, we have Maryland's Blueprint for the Future, which is expanding publicly funded high quality full day pre-K for 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. So this is happening through a mixed delivery system, which means that pre-K is not only offered in Baltimore City public schools, but also through eligible community-based and private providers. What is really interesting is that the state is phasing in a larger role for community-based providers with a goal that at least 50% of new pre-K slots to be delivered by private providers by 2029, so a couple of years from now. So one important finding from our RPP work is that children's early learning experiences actually matter. So in our research, we found that children who attended formal pre-K or EC settings before kindergarten show stronger school readiness and better school attendance from kindergarten through 5th grade compared to those who did not have any formal care experiences. At the same time, we had another important finding about ECE choice, and we found that ECE choice for families is not one size fits all, which is actually aligned with the state's policy on mixed delivery system. So in Baltimore City, even though we have expanded access and have seats available, not every seat is being filled in some neighborhoods. And that tells us that simply creating seats is not enough. So we try to understand families' access, preferences, and decision making. And through this research, what we learned was that families' preferences actually vary depending on their individual needs and circumstances. So in the future, looking ahead, I think I would say two topics are important for us in Baltimore City and in Maryland. So one topic that will continue to come up over the next year or two and few years is family enrollment and outreach. So as I mentioned, we have this new mixed delivery system, and as pre-K options expand, systems will need to better communicate with families, and then we need to have stronger outreach to help families understand what options are available, who's eligible, how they can apply, and why even pre-K matters. So in Baltimore, the mayor's office and other philanthropy, they've made investment in outreach and enrollment campaigns recently, which is very important. But at the same time, we really want to evaluate whether those efforts are effective. So research questions, something like whether families are actually hearing the message, are they applying, are we reaching families who have historically faced barriers to access, are we moving in the direction that the blueprint intended? Those are all important questions for us. The last thing I would say is about workforce development and the teacher pipeline. So pre-K expansion really depends on having a strong, stable, and well-supported early childhood workforce. And we know that turnover is already a real issue nationally in early care and education. And we cannot really expand pre-K access successfully without strong workforce and without caring about the people providing care and education for our young children. So if we want high quality pre-K, I believe that we really need to treat early childhood educators as essential professionals and build systems that support their well-being and long-term commitment to the field. So I say those two things are the things that would come up in the next few years in Baltimore and Maryland. Thank you.
Thanks, Lieny. Terri?
Hi, everyone. I am Terri Sabol. I'm an associate professor in the School of Education and Social Policy, and I'm also the faculty co-director of the Early Childhood Research Alliance of Chicago, or EC Reach. We just launched EC Reach about 2.5 years ago, so we like to say we're sort of in our toddler phase. But a key part of EC Reach has been to develop a research practice partnership on to understand the impact of the universal pre-K expansion in Chicago. So the context of our universal pre-K is there was a targeted expansion that began in 2013 that was primarily targeted towards low income schools that serve primarily low income children. And the universal expansion began in 2019. Since then, we've had 3 different mayors in Chicago, but each time the mayor has continued to support the expansion of universal pre-K. And it was complete in 2024, which means that there are now enough slots to serve all 4-year-old children in full day pre-K in the city of Chicago. I will note that a lot of the expansion, because there was already a targeted expansion program and some existing pre-K before the universal pre-K, a lot of it was actually converting half-day seats to full-day seats. Uh, you know, our the universal pre-K expansion, and I'm guessing this is going to be a similar thread across a lot of the context, is mixed delivery, but might sort of look different than other cities and states in terms of the mixed delivery. So when the universal pre-K expansion began within Chicago public schools, expanding out school-based pre-K in elementary schools or standalone places within Chicago public schools. They basically took into account the number of existing publicly funded slots in Head Start programs or other publicly funded preschool programs and used that to kind of count to make sure that those counted as some slots, and they added on school-based programming to basically create enough slots for all kids. But in terms of like how some other states and cities operate with mixed delivery, where there's like the same curriculum or the same pay for teachers, that's not the case in Chicago. So we have had a research practice partnership with the Department of Family Support Services, the Office of the Mayor, and the Chicago Public Schools to understand what the impact of this expansion was. And we focused on three key areas: access, this sort of market or systems, and the outcomes. And so what we found is, our first question was like, if you build it, do they come? And the truth is, children did come and attend. And there was a pretty significant increase in the number of kids that are attending publicly funded 4-year-old full day pre-K. So for example, in 2018, before the expansion, there were around 8,000 kids who were in full day pre-K in Chicago Public Schools, and that expanded to 15,000 by 2024. The second thing we looked at was to understand, if you greatly expand school-based pre-K, there was a real concern that that could have a negative effect on the community-based organizations. This was found in New York City, actually, when they expanded pre-K there. There was a pretty big effect on the number of closures of community-based programs. We did not find that in Chicago. So on both center-based programs and family childcare programs, there was not a particularly large effect. There was a small effect on just family childcare programs, about half of a program closed within a local community area. And then the last is we've been looking at the effect on outcomes, and I'll just highlight that we see some but small effect sizes around 0.05 standard deviation impact on third grade test scores. So a topic that we think is going to be coming up in the next year or two within Chicago is they've built this system, they've expanded access equitably, so they increase access across the economic spectrum. And now the question is, what the how and the what, right? What is what can lead to improvements in quality and the experience of kids that they're having. So sort of getting under the hood. And Chicago Public Schools is particularly interested in really thinking through how to improve the curriculum and think more about curriculum alignment between pre-K to 3. But I'll also say that I think the questions about teacher workforce, those also apply. So I think it's probably just like a +1 to everything that probably everyone else will say. But this is a key focus for Chicago Public Schools. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Terri. And I just want to give a reminder to folks, if you could put your questions in the Q&A so we all keep them all in one place, that will help us answer your questions when we come to the discussion time. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to our friends from California. No problem.
Morning. I'm Pamela Geisler, a director of the Early Ed Department in San Francisco Unified. We also, like the other districts, have had a lot of investments recently, over the past couple decades. In San Francisco, there have been propositions that voters voted for, one in 2004 that created something called Preschool for All, and another one followed up in 2018 called Early Education for All. And both of those provide a very significant amount of funding that's managed by a department that was created in conjunction with this called the Department of Early Childhood. So it's a city hub for early ed and for managing the funding. At the same time, California invested heavily in early education by creating a new grade called transitional kindergarten. It started in about 2012 with just a subset of children, those who were born between September and December. And in 2021, California rolled out the program incrementally for all 4-year-olds. So this year is the first year where all children who are 4 years old are eligible for transitional kindergarten, which is operated throughout the LEAs across California. And I'm going to pass it over to my partner, who we've been working for about 10 years together on different projects, to Laura, to talk about pre-K.
Thanks. Thanks, Pamela. Yeah, Pamela and I both work in the Stanford SFUSD partnership, which has been around since 2009. And just kudos to Pamela for her commitment to the work to support early childhood education and support the partnership. So two of the findings that really have stood out and seem to have influenced the district's thinking and policy just has been this concept that 2 years of early education is better than 1 year. This was based on a study conducted by Jelena Obradovic and her colleagues in partnership with SFUSD that looked at the longitudinal data of in the school district and looked at students that had 2 versus 1 year of preschool. Also, another really innovative project that Stanford professor Susanna Loeb worked on with SFUSD was an attempt at trying to support parent engagement in school and students learning through a program called Ready for K that sent tips via text message to parents 3 times a week. At first, it was just literacy tips. It expanded to math tips and SEL tips. And the district worked with Susanna Loeb and team to run a randomized control trial to test the effects of this program. And it really showed incredible gains for students. In fact, students that were part of the treatment program, they showed 2 to 3 months of learning from the intervention. So that's something that San Francisco then expanded, especially during the pandemic, to its elementary grades as well because of these positive effects. So just a shout out to, again, Jelena Obradovic and Susanna Loeb and other Stanford professors that have been working in the partnership and really built this body of knowledge. The most current topic that we're focused on, but I would agree with Terri that there's multiple topics being discussed, is the early education workforce issues. I'll just pass it back to Pamela to add a line or two about why that's an issue right now.
Yeah, I echo the shout out to the professors and the Stanford team. And then there's a couple of significant investments to the early education workforce. So in San Francisco, the funding that was voted in by SF citizens supports wage parity for preschool teachers. So there's been a pretty strong attempt to get community providers compensation comparable to the district compensation. So of course that poses the question of is higher pay, does that result in higher learning outcomes for children? It's definitely great for the educators, but how does it impact the students? And similarly, with TK, one thing that's part of that legislation is that all TK teachers must have a standard multi-subject credential in addition to the early ed 24 units or permit. So that impacts our ability to find eligible teachers, and it also poses a lot of questions about is that investment in education or that requirement for the higher levels of education resulting in higher outcomes for students. Thank you.
Thanks, Pamela and Laura. And I am going to turn over our last slide to Courtney from HERC.
My name is Courtney Thrash, and I am a researcher at the Houston Education Research Consortium. We are partnered with 8 school districts in the Houston region, and we do research in 2 ways. We do district-specific studies with some of our partners where we focus on a topic that they are interested in, and then we also do regional studies where we bring all of our partners together and kind of look at things more holistically. Texas has mandated that school districts provide half-day pre-K since 1985. I was a lucky recipient of public pre-K. And in the 2019-20 school year, it was expanded to full days. So districts were then required to provide full-day pre-K. It is free for students who qualify, and there are 6 ways that students can qualify for pre-K in the state of Texas, but the primary ways that students qualify are by showing economic disadvantage and economic need, and those students who are English learners, so who need support in learning the English language. Our research has consistently found that students who attend pre-K are more likely to be kindergarten ready. We found this across all of our partners, all 8 of them, that students who attend pre-K when they start at kindergarten are more likely to have the skills needed for kindergarten. And we specifically compared those students to kindergarten students who did not attend pre-K but would have likely qualified. So we are comparing a very similar group of students. We have a very experienced workforce in our public education system. On average, our pre-K teachers have 10 years of teaching experience. But we have seen that ECE specific certifications are very rare. So we had, I think, less than 10% of our teachers have kind of a certification focusing on pre-K to 3 grades, because we know that educating and teaching a pre-K student is very different than teaching a sixth grader, you know? So we focused on those ECE early grades, and we found that those certifications are pretty rare. So we are hoping that we see kind of an increase in those over the years. A topic that we are thinking about pretty heavily is vouchers. So Texas recently enacted a program of education savings accounts for parents so that they can use. Most students receive up to $10,000, although some students can receive up to $30,000 to attend private school in Texas. And so we don't fully know the effects yet, because next year will be the first year that families can use those funds to attend private school. We don't really know the effect of those vouchers on public pre-K enrollment. For now, the pre-K funds are only available to families who would have qualified for public pre-K. So there is it's just kind of unknown what's going to happen with that. And we're already seeing some effects of kind of demographic change on public pre-K enrollment. So just up in the air about how that is going to affect enrollment.
Thanks, Courtney. I am going to encourage our panelists to turn their cameras back on so we can chat with each other. I have so many questions for you all, and the chat has a lot of questions too, so I'm excited about this. One of the things that Courtney ended on, and I know a few of you alluded to in the conversation, is around enrollment. So what are some of the things that you all have been seeing in your spaces around pre-K enrollment? While we're seeing more kids show up when it gets opened, to Terry's point, overall, is enrollment what we expect it to be in the pre-K space? Maybe if anyone could talk about what you're seeing in your places, what your districts are doing about it.
I mean, I'll just start since I am the one who brought it up. Yeah, so we're seeing some pretty big changes in enrollment in general in the Houston region. So we did some recent work looking at just like population change and looking at how we're losing kids in our urban core, and they're mostly moving up, not even into the suburbs, because we're also losing kids in our suburbs into the exurbs of the region. And so Houston is just growing so rapidly, but a lot of that growth is happening outside the urban core. And so we did this thing where we looked at births and then compared it to kindergarten enrollment. And obviously, those aren't necessarily the exact same kids because kids move. But we found that in the urban core, we have fewer kids showing up for kindergarten than expected given births. But if you look into like the exurbs, they are having so many more kids show up than expected given births. And that's because of huge mobility that's happening. So it's a huge concern there. Our districts I know multiple of our partners are running these kind of huge campaigns hoping to attract families, and using our research to show that like pre-K it works. But yeah, it's a work in progress.
Yeah, Terri.
Yeah, so Chicago also has declining enrollment in Chicago public schools from K to 8. So just as like concrete numbers, from 2016 to 2024, the kindergarten enrollment declined from 27,000 to 21,000 kids. One ray of hope, though, is that actually the full day pre-K enrollment has increased. And so something that we've been really interested in is to see if there's actually an impact of the universal pre-K expansion on kindergarten enrollment. The other thing I will say is that, and I'm sure our locale is no different than everyone on the call, is it's a tale of two cities, and the heterogeneity across the city is really important. And at least in Chicago, what we're seeing is that actually families in the lowest income neighborhoods are the ones that are leaving, and actually the higher income neighborhoods are increasing. And so that's just like an interesting puzzle as we're thinking through. Like it's not as simple as just declining enrollment. It's like where and when and how. And that's where we spend a lot of time at EC Reach is to try to like unpack that heterogeneity and also to work within community areas to understand kind of like what the needs are and the opportunities and barriers within community areas to understand access, because it's nearly impossible to kind of speak in general terms across a city like as big as Chicago.
Yeah, I know that in Baltimore we did similar birth like comparison with kindergarten and pre-K enrollment, and then we found that definitely decrease in birth nationally that's impacting pre-K enrollment. And another thing, what we found recently was that we look at the comparison between pre-K application forms and actual enrollment. And then we found that not every family was actually matched to the school that they were applied for. So like some misalignment between their preference, their zone school, and their matched school, that's actually impacting enrollment. And also by neighborhood as well, and then their income background and other eligibility criteria. So we're trying to do a lot of campaign to make sure that families are aware of different options. And then we are really hoping that this mixed delivery system coming in, having more private providers, flexible work schedule like hours that, and then those like offering could help with this enrollment in the city.
In San Francisco, we've had the same declining enrollment overall, but TK has definitely been the driving force in impacting enrollment. In SFUSD, our pre-K enrollment is less than half of what it was 5 years ago, so that's dramatically impacted our infrastructure and services. And TK enrollment has been very high. And I think so, as some panelists mentioned before, that impacts community providers. And there is a question and concern on their part as to whether they'll be able to sustain the changes that TK has caused. Great for families and education, but definitely changing the landscape of enrollment.
So let's keep talking a little bit about that, about the mixed delivery system. Terry talked about it, Lieny talked about it a little bit. We know that what we've seen in Texas is that people are scared of it a little bit. So what does mixed delivery mean for the organizations who are providing it? And what does it mean for public school districts? You know, some of the childcare facilities in the Texas, we've heard that they don't want to increase public pre-K because they're going to lose kids. But what does it mean? Does it just mean more kids show up if families have more options available to them?
Yeah, I can speak about Baltimore context. Like as I mentioned briefly when I was introducing our work in Baltimore and Maryland, our mixed delivery system in Maryland, I think is similar to what Terry you mentioned in Chicago. They're not getting the same curriculum. They're not getting like the same compensation across workforce. So we have very different system across public programs and private programs, but the goal is that by 2029, we have 50% of public seats and then 50% of private seats. At this point, private seats are only like, I would say 5%. So we have very ambitious goal here. What this really means for our families is that they will have more options. When we did surveys and interviews with families, we found that they have different needs. And I mentioned that they require different schedule, they require different curriculum, or they want to have different like environment. But at the same time, when we're expanding, the issue is that they really need clear and simple information. So if the system is complicated to us doing this study, then families may not understand what they're eligible for, how they apply, what options available across public schools and community-based providers. So I think that's really important to think about in our system. And the other thing is how to understand families' preferences across different settings and different neighborhoods, different locations. Because some families in certain neighborhoods, they prefer a school-based setting, while others in different neighborhoods, they may prefer a community-based provider because of hours, sibling care, trust, language, relationships. So I think it's really about not just adding seats, and it should be about creating options that actually match family needs in each neighborhood. And speaking a little bit about workforce, I think because of the different compensation system and benefits that public programs and private programs can offer, I anticipate like having huge issue in teacher turnover and community-based providers. So I think that's something to think about. And the last thing I would say is related to our work at Berkeley. Data systems really matter. Currently, we are integrating the data among publicly funded programs, but we don't have system yet to incorporate private programs. So now, if we have this mixed delivery system, it will be really hard for us to understand how we're serving families, how we're seeing child outcomes across both public and private programs. So I think there are several issues that we have to think about as we build a mixed delivery system, as it's comparatively new in Baltimore and Maryland.
And Terri, might you have any other thoughts on that? And then there's a question in the chat about the impact of community-based centers in Chicago, New York, and differences.
Yeah. So I'll try to, as briefly as I can, talk about the study that we did. So Jessica Brown, who is an economist, did a beautiful study in New York City where she looked at the rollout of the expansion in New York City on community-based organizations and found a pretty significant negative effect on the closures of community-based programs, especially in low-income areas and especially among programs that served infant toddlers. And so we just replicated that study. And so basically, what you do is you group the city into little neighborhoods. So in Chicago, it was about 150 mini neighborhoods that we think kind of reflect what the local childcare market is. So this meant about 18 like community-based programs, or 16 community-based programs, and two kind of school-based programs within each community area. And you basically see what happens to the community as the expansion occurs using sorry to do stats, but it's sort of a difference approach. So to understand kind of like what happens, what was the change that would have happened, comparing programs that didn't expand, neighborhoods that didn't expand to those that did expand. And what we find is that we basically see about 0.5 of a center close within each neighborhood, which is about 3% of the program. So it's just not that significant. And one thing that is important is like community-based organizations are closing all the time, right? So they're like, we know that they're opening and closing. And so you really want to know above and beyond what would have happened anyway, what happened. So we also did a qualitative approach to kind of understand like what was going on the ground. And community-based organizations were really savvy. Like they knew this was happening and they said, okay, we think we're going to lose our 4-year-olds to school-based. So let's expand out our offerings for 0 to 3. So one difference between us and New York City is that there was actually a fit, like the rollout was a true rollout. It happened very slowly over time. And so when you don't go from 0 to 100, it gives like community-based organizations enough time to kind of react and change their offerings. So that's one thing that happened in Chicago. The other thing is that like a lot of the expansion actually wasn't just like new seats in Chicago public schools. It was from half day to full day. So that's also a big difference. Um, and then I will also say that, like in our interviews with parents, like a lot of them were like, you know what, school-based doesn't work for us. Like we need a full workday covered, and the school-based programs didn't offer that, or they already had siblings in the community-based organizations, and so there was preference. So what we saw a lot, right, was actually parents taking advantage of finding the childcare programs that actually match their needs. And that also, I think, I mean, I think that was probably happening in New York City, so I don't think that's different between Chicago and New York. So to make sure I answer the question, it's really what we think was like the slow rollout and providing support for community-based organizations. And if I can do one more lesson learned, so community-based center-based programs could expand out for 3-year-olds. For family childcare programs, it was much more difficult for them to do so because of the state licensure requirements in terms of age groups, right? Like you can't serve you can't serve like 20 infants in a family childcare program. And so that was much more challenging. And so that's our hypothesis of why we're not seeing it in center-based programs and we are in family childcare programs.
Thanks, Terri and Lieny. I think one of the themes that I see coming up in the chat too for a lot of folks is you all are sharing such important, fascinating information that could have really big impacts for school districts and understanding programs and policies and how to make decisions. And I'm going to ask Laura and Pamela to maybe chat with us a little bit about how does this happen? How does the research practice partnership allow something like this to happen? We've got folks asking, how do I get this in Vegas where I am? Or what are the collaborations that need to exist for some partnership like these to come about? So Pamela, Laura.
Well, I would start with saying we have Laura, who is a fabulous liaison between Stanford and the district. So she's been doing this work very diligently, has lots of partnerships with professors and researchers at Stanford. And so we sort of have like a live lab here at SFUSD, and we can get findings like questions that we're curious about, get the answers to those as data comes in, and then we're able to share that with coaches and teachers and administrators here and sort of see the live impact of that right away. And I'll let Laura share a bit as well.
Yeah, I would give three responses to that answer, especially the Las Vegas question. I really encourage you to look locally at your universities or research institutes that are there. If you're a school district, you probably have partnerships with them for teacher training, but most large universities have economists, sociologists that are interested in working on these challenges that we've all been talking about related to the district. So reach out. They'd probably be interested in working with you. Second is it really takes a school district leader who has the vision for how they're going to use the research. And so what's different about research practice partnerships is it isn't a researcher sitting in their office thinking of these questions on their own. They're actually in conversation with the school district leaders saying, what questions do you need answered? And they're co-developing those questions. So that's the second thing. It really needs to have a district leader that, like Pamela or someone else on a different topic that's leading a different program, saying, I need information from this research 6 months from now, a year from now, to inform this upcoming decision. And then last but not least, I really feel like having specific routines and ways of engaging with each other. We can sit in our silos of practice and research. We even sit in different organizations and institutions. So finding ways where we can come together and talk about this research. I mean, webinars are a great way, but ultimately, the more we can make sense of this research together, rather than in our conferences where we don't interact with each other, I think really can help form these partnerships.
I'm going to ask Pamela one kind of specific question around this. So you're a representative of the practice side of a school district side. There's a little bit of vulnerability that you have to open yourself up to be engaging in research with people who are external to your district. Can you talk a little bit about what are some of like the benefits and challenges of engaging in research in this kind of way?
Yeah, I think the benefits are maybe pretty easy because we can have any kind of question. You know, we've had some about social emotional learning, and we have a 6-year study going on about how the impact of komochi is in the classroom. I think the trickier part is when the findings come back and, you know, they're not what we anticipated or they're not what we were hoping. And so I think it's a lot of conversation and dialogue with the researchers and then making some fine-tune adjustments. But over the years, I think it's been really important that that conversation be honest, but also nuanced and iterative so that there's time for people on the ground to make adjustments as needed, either in continuing to implement the research study or changing practices. And I think overall, when you have findings that you're not hoping for, it just takes a lot of conversation and willingness to make adjustments.
Yeah. Thank you. Courtney, someone asked, can you talk about what this looks like in Houston?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to echo what some of the other panelists have said about, we are reactive to what our district partners are interested in. And so we don't, none of our research questions, none of our products are driven by our own interests. It's all reactive to what our districts are interested in. And so when we have these, we have these regional studies where we have basically all of our partners coming together and saying, this is an issue for us. And so we've done stuff on student mobility. We've done stuff on pre-K. We're about to do something on teachers, CCMR, or college career military readiness. So those are all things that our partners have come together and said, this is what we need. And so looking at kind of that collective need is good because it shows, if all these districts in one area are coming together and saying, this is what we need, then it shows that probably across the state of Texas, this is a need, right? And then we have those district specific studies where it's a district comes to us and says, this is what this is what we need that's separate from maybe what other, and that might be certain programs or certain issues they're grappling with. And so I think all of it, like I said, is reactive. And I think that's the benefit, right? Is that that's how you get the buy-in from the districts, is that you're addressing something they need immediately that they don't necessarily have the capacity to do. And it's all done in this collaborative work. So it's not like a gotcha, like, hey, we're going to get this finding and it's going to, no, it's all framed in that we all have a collective desire to improve public school for kids, right? We all have, that's we all have the same goal. And so it's about working together, and it's never, framed as we're trying to get you, we're trying to, it's all, if we do find something that maybe isn't so super positive, okay, what are some recommendations? How can we move it in that direction so that kids are benefiting from the best education that we can give them?
Okay, thanks. One of the things that's come up in the chat and in the different conversations reflected in both your slides and in some of the answers we have today is about the workforce. And so one of the questions that we have in the chat is around specialized training in early childhood. As Courtney reflected, one of the things we've seen here at HERC is like we have teachers with tons of experience, pre-K teachers with tons of years of experience, but not specialized training in early childhood. So what are the things that you've seen districts trying in your different spaces, or is this something that people aren't thinking about, right? So all pre-K teachers in Texas have to have a bachelor's degree like every other teacher, but they don't have to have specialized training. So what does that look like in different spaces?
I want to add one thing I want to point out. I want to lend the answer to last question, this question. So to answer this question in San Francisco, we can't just talk to Pamela in the early ed department. We also need to talk to the HR department. And while that sounds easy, it's not like they have a lot of mechanisms for talking to each other. So one of the ways to do that is to do a study and answer these questions together. And that's what we're starting off doing on this topic. In that it is very different to have a teacher certification versus ECE units. And there's changes in requirements now with the transitional kindergarten program. I don't know, Pamela, if you want to add to that.
No, I think there's lots of research questions. One practical thing that we've done is apply for funding to support teachers and to actually go back to school and get their education. So whether that's on the early ed side or a bachelor's. And then we partner with the local state, SF State and community colleges and USF to support students to do that. We've at times created classes and had a pipeline back and forth, and that's been pretty impactful.
Lieny, are there things that you're seeing in Baltimore around training?
Yeah, in Baltimore, I would say that we don't have consistent training system across the city and city schools, but they have different pathways available if they're interested in pursuing. One discussion we have as we're expanding through mixed delivery system is how to provide better support for community-based providers because their qualifications might look very different across pre-K programs between public and private programs. So that's one thing we're thinking about. The other discussion we have is that once we support teachers to have more qualification and certificates in private programs, they tend to move over to public schools with the qualifications for better pay and better benefits. So I mean, I'm not directly speaking to the question, but I think that's one of the things that we are like considering in our city. And it's not necessarily about qualification, but turnover. We've been thinking about how to reduce turnover. We recently did a study in the city, and then we found that for some programs, they have greater than 100% turnover in a year, which means that they have more teachers leaving the position than the positions available. So some of pre-K classroom, we don't have that many classrooms closed due to turnover in public pre-K settings, but we do have closed classrooms in private settings serving pre-K slots. So that's something that we are thinking about in terms of qualifications and then how to keep teachers who are qualified and then who are trained in early childhood education, and how can we basically keep those teachers who had been trained.
Lainey, one of the things you were talking about around, developmentally appropriate skills that they're learning about that, and a question that's in the chat is also making me reflect on Terri. One of the things that you said we need to be thinking about around pre-K 3 and what does the curriculum look like for pre-K 3. So a question in the chat is around how do you make sure pre-K classrooms stay developmentally appropriate? How threes are different from fours? So Terri, any reflections you have on that? And then Courtney, I might ask you about that.
Yeah, so I agree with whoever wrote the question, right? That we certainly do not want pre-K to become third grade, right? And that there is a specific type of developmentally appropriate practice that we know is not only good for kids in terms of their development of self, but also for their academic learning. Like we know that kids learn through play. I'm probably preaching to the choir here. And I like am optimistic in Chicago Public Schools actually that that they are holding that in the center as they're thinking about the pre-K to 2 and third grade curriculum alignment, which is to ensure that we're embedding developmentally appropriate practices in pre-K and then pulling them up. Like what I would much like to see is like us taking the things that we know from early childhood and moving it up rather than the opposite. That is what's traditional. And I think as a field, the extent to which we can really are like clearly articulate, and lots of folks are doing this, like I'm not the first to say it, but that like these don't come at a cost. Like there aren't trade-offs. Like if you play, kids aren't learning, right? It's like it's collectively, this is how you can get the best outcomes for kids. And that there's really strong evidence on that. And I think Chicago Public Schools is actually really committed to that. So I'm actually optimistic.
Courtney, this idea of like, having pre-K for threes and fours. So we had done some research a few years ago, also kind of like the San Francisco team around years of pre-K. So like 1 year of pre-K versus 2 years of pre-K, meaning like 4 years old only or 3 and 4. Can you talk a little bit about that and what we saw?
Yeah, so we did find that having 2 years of pre-K, those students saw bigger gains than students who had 1 year, but we saw the biggest jump between 0 and 1 rather than 1 and 2 years. And what we found in our conversations with the district is that for many of the 3 year olds, they were receiving the same curriculum 2 years in a row. So they were not giving developmentally appropriate curriculum for 3 year olds and then developmentally appropriate curriculum for 4 year olds. They were just giving them the same curriculum 2 years in a row, which is why we don't think we saw as big of an increase in the effect of that second year of pre-K. And so I think making sure that we have that developmentally appropriate curriculum, but I think it goes beyond just the classroom because in our conversations with some of our partners, we've had where it's also like principals and like vice principals who don't necessarily know what a pre-K classroom is supposed to look like and that it should look different from classrooms in other grades. And so some of our partners have reflected that like the ECE departments have had to have conversations with principals and shown them like what a developmentally appropriate pre-K classroom looks like. And they've made remarks of like, I need to go back and reevaluate my pre-K classrooms because now that I know that what they're supposed to look like, they were evaluating them against what they expected 2, 3, and 4 year old. I mean, 2, 3 is the second, third, and fourth grade classrooms are supposed to look like, which is not what we know is most effective. So I think it goes beyond just what does the classroom look like, and also making sure that the broader school and district knows what the classroom is supposed to look like and what is most effective because it doesn't look the same.
And I guess not just look the same in terms of ages, but the compositions. So we have a few questions in the chat that I think reflect some of the things we talked about before around enrollment too, is what do our districts look like? What do, in terms of the student composition, like is the demographic composition of school districts changing? Is anyone seeing the impact of recent immigration legislation and reforms on who is showing up and who is having access to, especially the pre-K spaces? Is anyone seeing that in their cities?
I can speak a little bit about what we see among immigrant families in Baltimore City. We have about 10% of Hispanic Latinx population in the city at this point, and it's been increasing like significantly. One unique thing in our school district is that, and then in the state, is that we have Judy centers, which is wraparound services for birth to 5, housed within public schools. So Judy centers naturally recruit families from birth and even prenatal stage. So they were able to build a lot of trust with the community, especially for immigrant families. So each Judy Center, we found that they have WhatsApp group that they can come and then they share like concerns, and it's kind of like private group that nobody can see. So the Judy Centers helped a lot with communities to actually trust the school even before they come to school. So we didn't see that much decrease more like in enrollment for immigrant families. And I think it's because we have this built-in system that's been there for many years that was getting trust from the community.
Chicago or San Francisco or Houston, have you, I mean, one of the things that's it's hard to know, right? Until like unless if the kids aren't showing up, we don't know what the impact is. And so I don't know if that's what you're feeling in your spaces too. That's what we felt in Houston. Our district partners are wondering what the impact is, but it's hard to know until kids don't show up.
Yeah, I was just saying, like in Houston, we don't know. Erin and I are currently exploring ways that we could possibly look at the effect of some of these policies on enrollment. Because I think my question is it affecting enrollment generally, or are we more seeing like an effect on like absences when there are targeted campaigns in the region? Like, are we seeing kids staying home for just kind of chunks of time, and so leading to like higher chronic absenteeism? Are we seeing a complete disengagement from the system altogether? That is something we have been talking with our demography team about as well, about like how we could potentially look at the effect of this. But I think right now it's really unknown.
Yeah, I would say the same thing as Courtney, which is Chicago had an increase in new migrant families like 2 years ago. And they're with all of the immigration enforcement, like anecdotally, there is discussion that kids are not going to school. But I like in terms of hard numbers, Erin, exactly what you're saying is like it's we don't have them. And I actually think, Erin, what you're bringing up is actually a really good point, which is like is really trying to make sure that we do document kind of what's happening in the schools.
Yeah. All right, we're coming up on time, so I'm going to ask you. I saved the hardest question that I have for last, and you'll all have to answer it. So, the hardest question that I have is you all have shared amazing research that you've done that's showing the benefits of pre-K. We see kids showing up more ready at kindergarten. Some of the studies have showed, results like longer past kindergarten. But then we also see some studies that come up. People might see things on social media or in the news about research that says that pre-K doesn't work or pre-K isn't giving the benefits to kids. And so what would you encourage people to think about when they see research and to how they can evaluate it from maybe a lay perspective of like, do I buy the story that people are trying to share with me? So what are things that people should keep in mind when they're seeing that come up?
I'm happy to start. Um, I would say two things. So first, I would just start by looking at the source of the information, like who's saying that, what's the evidence behind it. But then I would also triangulate. Go talk to people in your community that are doing this work and ask them, is this true? And try to triangulate that information from this one social media post that you see. Start a conversation. There's others with evidence in your local community about these topics, but you have to start by engaging with them and not just hearing a soundbite.
I think we also have to consider that it's not just pre-K. Like if there's not continuity, if you can have heavy investment in pre-K, but if you don't have heavy investment in the grades that come afterwards, and then you're looking at kids years down the road, that if you don't have that continuity, which I think Terri has talked about, that pre-K to three, pre-K to third grade pipeline. And I think that's really, really important. And so making sure that you have that continued investment and you have that continued curriculum across is really important, and that's going to vary across contexts.
I'll just add that the evidence base is unequivocal that in the short term, like rigorous studies find positive short-term effects. Where it gets muddy is when we look in the long term. And as Courtney said, there's lots of reasons we might see sort of decline in those effect sizes over time. And that there's basically only one or two studies that are really finding things that are getting a lot of press in the midterm that are not positive. Most of it is null or small in kind of the medium term. So I would just want to untangle the mess a bit of what are we talking about. But the good news is pre-K leads to short-term effects, and that's good news.
Yeah, one thing I would add is about what's being measured, like especially outcomes, what kind of outcomes we're looking at. Most likely those studies look at academic cognitive skills, but in pre-K, students are learning how to learn and how to sit, how to come to schools. I think there are different outcomes that we don't necessarily measure in research, and also for whom and over what period of time. So pre-K is not definitely a single thing. Like programs vary a lot in quality, dosage, workforce quality, curriculum, family engagement, like a lot of things in broader K to 12 system. So I think we have to look at the system altogether to evaluate how we would interpret the findings from those studies.
Thank you. Pamela, is there anything you want to add at the end?
I think just, I've been talking with my seventh grader about primary and secondary resources and how to make sure that the resource that you're getting your information from is valid. So Laura mentioned that. Also, like Jenny was saying, the social emotional impact of pre-K, I think there's a lot of studies that show that that's pretty impactful. So taking a look at different aspects of how pre-K and early learning impacts children.
Well, thank you all. Thank all the panelists for joining us. This is an amazing conversation. Thanks for the folks who join us and ask questions and engaged in that way too. We hope this is the beginning of a conversation and not the end of a conversation. So one of the things I'll note is that we'll put this up on our YouTube page. Feel free to share it out with folks. We'll send an email out after the event with more information about the organizations that all this great research is, so you can find that too. And so again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you soon.